Hello again, we're back for part 5 in the rebuild series, and what I'm doing today is I'm setting up the suspension geometry on the car, including the back axle. That's the 4-link setup with the Watts linkage, and then I'll move to the front. There's a lot of stuff that we can do at home with like just simple stuff, bits of string and some measuring tape to get the car as close and as square as possible before I then take it somewhere to get it properly aligned. The first thing I'm going to do when you're setting up the rear axle is to make sure the nose angle of the diff is correct, and we start by measuring the engine angle. So let's grab my inclinometer and I'll take you there. Okay, so I'm going to check and set the nose angle of the diff, and that's important for the prop shaft. So whatever angle the engine and gearbox are sitting at, sloping down, as we go along the prop, the diff must be at the same angle. So for example, if the engine's sloping down 4 degrees, then the diff needs to point up 4 degrees so that they're the same included angle. And what that does, it gives the joints in the prop shaft a much easier time, and it also prevents vibration. So easy way to do that is with a digital inclinometer like this. It's just an electronic spirit level, if you like, and I get the engine and I measure that. So that's at 2.94 degrees, and then we'll pop under the car. We'll pop under the car and attach the inclinometer to the faceplate of the diff. So engine was at 2.95, diff's at 2.94, so that's a difference of 0.04 degrees, which is 2/10 of fuck all. So for all intents and purposes, that's cock on. Okay, and I'm going to show you how I adjust that. So when I'm setting the prop shaft angle with the engine and gearbox and the diff, the most important thing is that they're the same or really close. So whatever the angle the engine points down at, the diff nose needs to point up at. And that value that I'm looking for, there is a sweet spot, and it's 4 degrees. Okay, 4 degrees is the number that Ford set it at, and it gives the prop shaft joints a much easier time. So I know that my shell, as I measure it, is actually 1 degree up at the back. So with the car up at the back 1 degree, I'm looking for the engine and gearbox to be 3 degrees down, which they are. I've just showed you that. And the diff nose to be 3 degrees up, and that would give me an included angle of 4 degrees, which is exactly what I'm after. And I've managed to achieve that to within 0.04 of a degree, which is more by luck than judgment, but we got it. So we know that we can adjust the angle of the diff with the 4-link bars. What you do about the angle of the engine is if it isn't exactly where you want it to be. Now you've probably got a different engine and box in there like I have. You've probably changed the cross member and the engine mounts and stuff, and it could be anywhere largely. So if I just show you how I adjust the engine and box angle, and it's really pretty simple. We just use the gearbox mount. If I want more of an angle down, I'll space the gearbox mount out away from the body, as I've done here. I'll take care of that little chip later, that's no problem. But if I wanted the gearbox to be up less of an angle, if I had too much angle, then I'd use this mount here in the middle and I'd pack it out. So I'd pack out between the gearbox and the gearbox mount and force the gearbox up in the tunnel, raising it that way. I didn't have to do that, so that means I've got to pack it down. I ended up using different size washers until I got the measurement I wanted. till I got that engine sitting at 3 degrees down. I ended up with these fat washers that take it about 6.5 mil. Well, it is exactly 6.5 mil. Now they're only temporary, so I'm going to make some proper spacers out some 6.5 mil thick aluminium sheet, drilled and shaped, and they can go between the body and the gearbox mount, and they'll be permanently set then. So that's how you achieve the angle that you're after. So excuse the lollipop sticks, but it works for the purposes of demonstration. This is a 4-linked back axle. So if this is the axle and this is the nose of the diff and the prop shaft goes on there, you've got 2 lower links and 2 upper links. The front end of the links are rubber bushed, and the rear end have got rose joints on, so they can be screwed in and out and effectively adjust the length of the arm. So adjusting the nose angle of the diff once it's in the car is pretty straightforward. You will either lengthen the top arms, making it go like that and lifting the nose up, or you shorten the bottom arms, again pointing the nose up. So that's really pretty straightforward, and that's the first thing you need to do when you're setting up the back axle, is to get the nose angle correct, because then you can lock it off. So you lock all your joints off, and then what we're worried about is that the axle is square in the car and not on the piss. And this time, instead of adjusting the top or the bottom, we adjust both on the left or both on the right, and we can skew if the axle that way or that way. So that's what I'm in the process of doing now, and I'll show you where I'm up to. So to make sure that that axle is square to the body, we're going to use the floor to mark all the points off. And basically we copy fixed points on the car's chassis underside that we know are going to be accurate, and translate them to the floor and mark them on the floor, and do the same with the axle, and then we can do our measuring and adjusting. So the very first thing I did is to use the rear spring hangers, because they're what's known as a datum point. They're going to be fixed, and they should be fairly accurate as anything's going to be on a 1970s Escort shell. So I put a bolt in, and I drop a plumb line from this point here over the front, and I drop it down and I mark it on the floor. Okay, and I did the same for the other side. I'd put aluminium tape, because it's this stuff. It's piss thin. It's really sticky, and you can draw on it and it stays there, and it doesn't rub off like masking tape or peel off. So it's pretty good for being permanent. And then I do the same thing on the axle. So for the same point on both sides, I'll wrap the line around the axle down to a plumb bob weight, and I'm going to mark it on this tape here. So with 2 marks, one either side, if I join the dots with a straight line like I've done over there, I'm going to know how parallel the axle is to the body, and also I can split the difference and put a mark in the middle, and it'll give me the centre line of the axle and of the body. So for the moment, all I need to know is the distance between this mark and that mark the same, and is the distance between that mark and that mark on the body the same. And if it is, then I know my axle is square to the body, and I adjust that using the rose joints. So take this bolt out, pop it out the bracket on the axle, spin it round on the threads, lock it back up again, push it in, put my bolt back in, and this side of the axle would either come backwards or forwards in car line, depending on how much I adjusted it. And I can dick about until I get that distance from this point here to the point I'd measured and marked over there exactly the same on both sides of the car. Then I know my axle is square to the body. So we're back under the car, and I've measured from this line, which is taken directly off the body, straight off the spring hanger mount hole, bolt hole, straight down to there. The distance from there to the plumb bob on the axle is 419mm. The absolute number doesn't really matter. What does matter is that both sides are the same. So I've got my steel rule, the same measure as used for both sides. It's on the line, exactly the same. And my plumb bob's there. And it's hard to get a picture of it accurately here, but I'll tell you now, it's at 419mm. So it's cock on. So I now know that my axle is perfectly parallel to my body, okay? And I did that by lengthening the links on this side, because when I got to it, my first couple of measures, it was like that, and I just lengthened the links, and it only took a few threads to get a few extra mil, and now it's parallel. So now what I need to do is make sure that that axle is central in the car that way. So when you're measuring and setting up the geometry on a car, everything is set from the back axle. You set the back axle first to the body, so the back axle and body are your datum, and then everything gets thrown forward to what's known as the thrust angle to the front axle. But we've got a bit more work to do on the rear axle first before we can do any of the front. So now we know the axle is parallel to the body, but we've got to make sure that it's central within the body. So I'm going to go back to my lollipop sticks. So with our 4-link axle bolted to the car and all the link bars secured, the axle is very well located in the fore aft position. I can't move it that way, okay? And it will rotate around its pivot points and the suspension will work just fine. But because these are all rose joints, there's nothing to stop the axle flapping around from left to right, literally nothing. On the old setup with a pair of leaf springs, the leaf spring determines the axle's position both backwards and forwards and central within the car, but we've got rid of them. We've just got 4 links now. So what we need is something on the back, and there's 2 ways of doing that. There's the most simple way is what's known as a panhard rod or a 5-link, and you attach a bar with a couple of rose joints, one end to the body, one end to the axle, and it stops the axle moving in this direction but still allows it to travel up and down, okay? But the trouble is with that, the axle, if you look at this bar, travels in an arc, in a C shape, okay? So the whole axle will travel in an arc. So the way to get round that is a more complicated 6-link suspension. Now this is going to be fun, but I'll have a go. So with a 6-link or a Watts link, you have this bar which is pivoted in the middle and bolts to the centre of the axle and swings like this, and then you have 2 arms, one there and one at the bottom. And the idea is that the suspension can travel up and down, okay, but it can't move side to side because this point here and this point here are attached to the body, and this point here is attached to the axle. And the axle can move up and down, no problem, but it can't move side to side, and it keeps it in a perfectly, well, almost perfect straight line, certainly a better angle than a panhard rod. So to set the angle, to set this up in the car, all we need to do is make sure that the axle is central within the body. I don't want it over here and I don't want it over there. And the way I do that is by adjusting the length of the upper and the lower arm. I can make them shorter to pull it over this way, make this one shorter, make this one longer rather, and make this one shorter. Would pull the axle over this way, or if I make that one longer and that one shorter, it would pull my axle over the other way. So enough lollipop sticks, let's have a look at the real thing. So this is the Watts linkage on my car. You can see we've got that pivot in the middle, which pivots around this point here. There's a lower link there, which bolts to the body, a bracket on the body, and an upper link, which bolts to a bracket on the body over here. There's a bush this end, and there's a bush that end, and the rose joints are here. So all I need to do is I'm going to get my plumb line, and I'm going to drop it from the exact centre of the diff there, and I'm going to strike it down and mark it on the floor. Okay, and then looking further down the car, I've already got a centre mark there which I worked out between the two spring hangers. I'm going to go up the floor towards the front of the car. I'm going to make 2 more points. I'm going to make multiple points all along the length of the car, which should be the same on either side, and that's generally there's the datum holes in the chassis rails. I'm going to mark them on the floor. I'm going to mark all the centres, and I should be able to strike a line all the way through and give me a true centre line of the car. So I'll get the centre line of the car, and then I will make adjustments to these 2 links using these rose joints and these threaded nuts, and I'll lengthen and shorten the bars until the diff, the centre of the diff, is exactly in the centre of the body. And that's pretty much then the rear end is set up. I know that the axle is parallel to the car widthwise, and I know that it's central, and I know that the nose angle of the diff matches the nose angle of the engine and gearbox, and that's as much as I can set up. And then from there we'll move to the front of the car. So let me mark some lines on the floor, and I'll see how far my axle is out side to side. Okay, so now we're at the front of the car, as you can see, and I've dropped some plumb lines down from the I'm actually using the track control arm bolts because they're equidistant from the centre of the car, and they're what we call the suspension hard points. So they are the inner pivots for the lower track control arms, and by dropping plumbs down either side and marking that on the floor and then splitting the difference straight down the middle, I'll have the centre line of essentially the front axle. Let's go and show you how I'm marking out the centre of the car underneath. Oh, and yeah, the sharp-eyed amongst you will notice that I've had a bit of a trim. You can thank the wonders of video editing for that. Right, let's stop dicking about. Let's get under there and have a look. Okay, starting with the front axle first. Go up and you'll see. Shine a bit of light on it. So that's how I'm dropping the string over the inner track control arm bolt, and if I do it the opposite way the other side, then the distance between the centre to the outside of that piece of string will be theoretically absolutely equal. And then I'll drop the plumb down and mark it on the floor, and the same the other side. I'll measure the 2, split the distance and draw a line, and that is the centre line of the front axle. and then I'll go along and I'll show you doing the body, how I'm marking the centre line of the body, and then finally we can set and check the centre line of the rear axle. So we're back under the car and I'm trying to find the centre of the body line accurately, and for that I'm going to use two different bits of information. I'm going to use the suspension hard points, as they're known, which is the pivot for the track control arm up there. I've dropped the spring bob down, and also the rear leaf spring, the front pivot on the rear leaf spring, and also on the body I can use these holes. There's another one there, there's one there and one there. Now them holes aren't to let the water out, those holes are fixture positions. So when the car's built originally, they have they'll put the chassis rails on a framing line, and there'll be spikes, and these chassis rails will locate on the spikes on all the different holes front to back, and that's jigged into position then before the floor pan's loaded and the floor pan's welded to the frame rails. So what I'm going to use is the centre of these holes and go down and mark it on the floor on both sides, and then I know in between that hole and that hole, half the distance is the centre of the car, and that's marked there on this piece of tape. And the way I've done it with these plums, a plumb line, is I found a little bung in my box of many things that fits the diameter of that hole perfect, okay, and then I've drilled on a hole right in the centre for the string to go in, and then it comes back out again at the big hole, and with a bit of gaffer tape I can hold the string up, I can adjust the height, I'll pull that other string, and as I pull it the plumb line goes up and down, and I'll rest it down till it's just hovering just above the floor, and then I can tape it off, and then when it's settled down and stopped moving around, I'll mark that point, and I'll repeat that for the other side and mark that point, and then measure the distance, which was 668mm, and I'll split it, which is 334mm, and mark a centre line. And I do that for each of the fixture holes along the car. So I've got to do this one, and I've already done the rear spring, and then I can strike a line from the back all the way to the front, and I'll know the exact centre line of the car. Once I've got the exact centre line of the car, I can line up the rear axle, and I'll talk to you about that in a bit. And I can also double check that the front cross member, which I've just shown you, is also central in the car and all lined up, and then we can take our accurate measurements from there. Okay, then the last bit of the rear axle setup. So as you can see, I've sent plumb lines down and marked the floor for the front axle, and then I've done two off the front end of the chassis rails using some equidistant holes and marking out the centres. You can just see it faintly. There's the centres, and then two more lines at the back using two more datums on the rear chassis line and mark the centres. I've also got the rear suspension hard point, which is the front eye of the leaf spring, and mark the centre. And now I've dropped a plumb straight down off the centre of the diff. So that's the centre of the pivot point on the Watts linkage, straight down on the floor. And what I'll do next is I'll use a laser, just a DIY laser level thing, at the front of the car, and I'll line up all the marks on the floor, and that'll strike a line, and hopefully that pointer will point somewhere close to that line, and I'll know then that my axle is central within the body and also central to the front axle. And if it's not, then I need to adjust the rose joints on the top and bottom of the watch linkage to move the axle to the left or to the right. So let's get that laser level out and see where we are. Okay, we're back underneath, the laser's on. Turn the lights off in the garage to help me see it a bit better. And the laser is lined up perfectly with all the marks I've made. So far, right from the front to the back, front axle, body, all perfectly in line. Let's go and have a look at that plumb at the back and see how far out we are. So there we go. So looking from the back, I'm about 5mm off to the right from the centre line of the car, and also fortunately the centre line of the front axle, because the front axle, being the cross member bolted to the chassis, isn't really adjustable unless you overlap the holes, but then there's nothing to stop it moving, so that's really not a good idea. In any case, it's square to the body, and it's just the rear axle that's 5mm off to the right. So now I'm going to go and adjust those watch links, and let's see if I can get it a bit better. So after a bit of fucking about, I've managed to get it cock on, and I mean cock on. I went too far first time round, I had to move it back again, but that laser throws out a crosshair, and if you take a look, it's actually lighting up the string. Come on, turn the flash off. There you go. So you can see the vertical line on the laser is lighting up that string all the way from top to bottom, so it's perfectly vertical and it's bang on the line. So that's a better result than I was hoping for. I can't believe it's lighting up that string. That's pretty amazing. So yeah, so now my back axle is square in the car. Happy days. Time to move on to the front end. Okay, so I've dropped the car around, I've popped the bonnet on, spun it round so the front end's now facing that way, and I can get to the front suspension and work on the front end. Before we go there, I need to pop a few steps back actually, and explain the initial setup. So first thing was the 4-link bars, and the way I set them up was basically I made sure that they was all the same length. I undid the rose joints and assembled the axle to the body with all the arms exactly the same length. Now if whoever put the 4-link boxes in has done an half decent job, you should be pretty close. Luckily I was. So with your axle in and pretty much your wheels central to the wheel arch, which determines your wheelbase between the front and rear axles, I needed to make sure that the car was level and up in the air so I could get access to it. I haven't got the luxury of a 4-poster ramp, so I built these blocks, and it's just some 2B1. This is actually roofing batten that I had left over from building this place with my mates. Bit of 2B1 roofing batten, it's about 14 inches long. Pile them up to get to a decent working height, and the important thing is that they can move, so I've put them on twin wheel casters, just cheap ones off Amazon. But as you adjust your suspension, it's going to want to move, and that allows me to set and adjust it when the car's at ride height, because that's the first step. When you get the car onto the blocks and you're working on it and you're setting the back axle and you go to set the front axle, you must do it with the suspension under load and the car at ride height. So I've been round and I've set my coilovers at the back and set my coilovers at the front. I know my car's level side to side, and I know it's sitting at the ride height I want to sit it at. So with the ride height set and the car up on the air, and when I make adjustments, the wheels and suspension can move. They're not constricted by, you know, the friction of the rubber on the floor. You're going to get a more accurate result, and you get halfway there. Just as a reminder, this is only an initial setup. I'm not going to go fucking racing at a racetrack with a bit of string and a bit of tape, but it's going to get you somewhere close. You don't need fancy tools. All you need is a bit of tape and a plumb line, and that's it. You can get away with not needing a laser level. You can use a bit of string, and you can get away without having a fancy inclinometer. You can get an app on your phone that does it. It's a level app, and it works decent, and it will get you close. It just means that you're not going to find the nearest ditch on your way to the wheel alignment centre. So that's quite a lot of content for this one. So I'm going to cut the video in two there, and this will be the end of part 5, the build up, and I'll see you in part 6. Make sure you come back, hit that subscribe button, and you'll see the part 6 when it pops up. If you like what I've done, got anything to say, I'll see you in the comments. Give us a thumbs up. Cheers. So here's what you can do if you vape and you've got a laser.